First of all, thank everybody for coming on a Friday, especially. Thanks to the panelists for reading the book. I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. And thanks, Paige, for the introduction. And thanks especially to Catherine, who has just done a tremendous job organizing this event. So these are my two co-authors, John Reuter and David Szakonyi. David is a PhD from the Columbia Political Science Department, and John Reuter is a former postdoc at the Harriman Institute. So the book has really deep Columbia roots. Heaven forbid, you were working in a coal mining plant in Siberia in 2018. But if you were, you might have received a message like this. These are instructions about how you should vote. It starts off, it says, get dressed and grab your passport. Go to this specific voting place by 12 o'clock. Make your choice and vote. Then call your boss at this number and then go party. Homer Simpson. Or if you were working in a manufacturing plant, thank you very much. If you're working in a manufacturing plant in Sverdlovsk, you would have gotten this text message. Hey guys, this is really important. Everyone must vote. This is mandatory. Turnout will be reviewed, and I'm afraid to think of the consequences. Vote for who you want. The most important thing is to vote. Or if you were working at a fracking plant in Pennsylvania in 2020, you would have been told by your boss that you don't have to show up for this specific event with this specific political figure, but you won't be paid if you don't. Right? And finally, if you take the Amtrak train north from here, you will see this sign, vote for Trump, put up by the owner of this sticker factory in Schenectady, New York. Right? So these are all examples of workplace mobilization. And here in our book, we're really focusing on employers and politicians getting their employees to the ballot box. So there's been historical work on this mostly from Europe and the United States. There's more contemporary work, mostly done by two of the three panelists. Alex's work on the US case and Jessica's on the Ukraine case. Also, Isabella Mara's and Lauren Young on Hungary. But there's a lot that we don't know about it. We don't know how widespread it is. We don't understand the political dynamics especially well. So one of the things we're trying to do is just kind of, what is workplace mobilization and how does it function? We're also interested in the conditions under which it happens. Why do some firms mobilize their workers and other firms not? And then we want to ask, is workplace mobilization undemocratic? Or what forms of workplace mobilization might be considered undemocratic? So our approach is we start with Russia. That's the core case, and that's where we have really rich data, survey data, administrative data, crowdsourced data on violations of election law. We do survey experiments, and we have a lot of really rich data. But one of the things we really wanted to do was to figure out, does this happen in other settings outside of a post-Soviet setting? So we did surveys in a range of countries, not in the most autocratic countries. I don't think our argument really works well where elections don't matter. But we looked at countries at ranges of economic development, different political systems, just because we wanted to get a sense of how common it is. And one of the things that we see, one of the first kind of findings of the book, is that workplace mobilization is much more common than most people think, right? So in each of the countries where we did surveys, we asked whether employees experienced any of these specific mobilization tactics. And we found that between 20 and 50% of employed respondents in all of the 8 countries experienced at least one of these. Right? So this is pretty common. In a number of places, it's more common than party mobilization. And from work we do in chapter 3, we show that in Venezuela and in Russia, using survey experiments and some observational data as well, that workers responded stronger to appeals by their bosses than by party leaders. So this is something that we should know about. I can go through the data on individual cases, but in the interest of time, not. The second thing you need to know is that workplace mobilization is really unpopular. Nobody likes it. Even in Russia, when we asked firm managers, they said 77% of them said that it was an inappropriate tactic to use. So even as they use it fairly frequently, they realize that it's problematic, right? And workers and voters even more so. Even innocuous forms, like simply asking workers to vote. Most people don't want politics in the workplace. It's even more disproved of than vote buying. We show that in the book as well. And it's especially despised relative to party mobilization, which most people see as a normal kind of thing, right? So this generates a kind of tension, right? A trade-off that, on the one hand, politicians and employers can use their hierarchical positions to put pressure on workers to turn out to vote, but at the same time, they risk turning off the median voter, right? So that's one of the tensions that we're going to explore in this book. And kind of from this tension, we develop an argument about what types of firms are especially likely to engage in workplace mobilization. And we test it on 4 surveys in Russia, including surveys of managers and surveys of workers, because as you might imagine, they might view this problem in somewhat differently. We find that the results really don't depend on whether we're surveying managers or workers. So, whoops, let me go back. So we find that workplace mobilization is especially likely to happen when politicians have a lot of leverage over employers. So state-owned firms more than private-owned firms, firms that depend on the state for subsidies or for sales, and also asset and mobile firms. So firms in mining sector, natural resources, firms for whom it's hard to switch to another sector. Right? We also find that when employers have a lot of leverage over their workers, workplace mobilization is a lot more likely. So in slack labor markets, in most of the countries that we study, strongly related, and Alex's work as well, strongly related to the likelihood that one experiences workplace mobilization. We take advantage of Russia's many company towns as another area where it's especially likely to happen, and also state sector employees. One of the constants that runs through all the cases is that state sector employees are a lot more likely to be mobilized, except in Turkey. But the more interesting point, I think, here, though, is that there is this trade-off that even in Russia, employers and politicians really don't like it when news leaks out about workplace mobilization, because they know that it could create a scandal, right? So we find that so we can't really study this cross-nationally. We just don't have enough countries. But we can look within Russia, which has more than 80+ regions. And one of the things that we show is that in regions with low media freedom, the predicted probability of being asked to vote by your employer, controlling for other things, is about 0.4. But in regions with high levels of press freedom, it falls to about 0.3. So a pretty substantial decline, suggesting that workplace mobilization is conditional on the media environment. We also asked the same question about party mobilization, but we see that it's much lower, and we don't see the same kinds of conditional effects. Okay, so in the last kind of substantive chapter, we debate this normative question about whether workplace mobilization is undemocratic. And lots of the anecdotal evidence and survey evidence that we provide from Venezuela, Turkey, Russia, it's pretty clear that it's coercive, and that from a normative perspective, this is a restriction on voter autonomy, and there should be reasons why we think it's undemocratic. We talk a lot about the American case, where it's much more nuanced, right? On the one hand, one might think that this is a way to increase turnout. Increasing turnout is good for democracy. I presented this work to Jane Mansbridge, who knows more about this topic than anybody, I would think. And she said, look, a little coercion to get people vote, it's worth it. It's worth it normatively to increase turnout. So that was her argument. We take a slightly different take. And the Supreme Court has also said that employers have free speech rights, and you should be especially lenient, you should be especially unwilling to restrict free speech rights on political issues, and that employers should have the right to hold captive audience meetings where they require their employees to listen to political speech. So we argue that workplace mobilization can be democratic, but there's two really high hurdles. One is that it can't be implicitly or explicitly coercive, because this just restricts voter autonomy. And this is a very subtle thing, because if you get an email from your boss saying you should go vote for this party or bad things are going to happen to the firm, that might be a sincere expression of the information gleaned by the employer, who is in a very good position to give you information that might be useful for you. On the other hand, it might be cheap talk. And since workplace mobilization, even in the US, is often targeted at more marginalized employees, there are reasons to think that we should have a very high bar, and we should have protections in place to prevent this from happening. Also, given that workplace mobilization is often closely tied to the state, we also worry that it might increase incumbency advantage and create an unlevel playing field in ways that would also be undemocratic. So there are some conditions under which we would think that workplace mobilization could be democratic if it's not coercive and it doesn't involve a kind of systematic tilting of the playing field, but those are pretty high bars. Okay. Whoops, let me go back. So why should you should read this book? This is the most direct appeal, right? So my wife said, why you should buy this book? I don't know why you should read this book. It's a little more subtle. So this is a common but very much understudied form of electoral subversion. And also the dynamics of it are very different from other kinds of political mobilization. In the book, we compare workplace mobilization with voter mobilization by parties, and they differ in a lot of really interesting ways. So that's one reason. Also, we have very rich and novel data. We have heart-wrenching stories from our focus groups in Russia about this practice that add a lot of color and richness to the book. Also, if you're interested in these particular cases, you can learn a lot about the particular cases. For example, one of the things we see in Russia is that it's been very difficult to build political parties in Russia across the whole period. And one reason is that workplace mobilization can often substitute for party-based mobilization. But then also there's some broader implications as well. For example, there's a long held belief that industrialization and modernization will kind of eliminate the kinds of political clientelism that we see, as like political clientelism is often found in poor rural areas, very marginal groups. But we find that in some industrial settings, these same kinds of hierarchical relationships are reproduced, and this can give incentives to use that power for political purposes. Also, it sheds some light on democratization and economic structure, right? It tells us that autocrats like having rigid labor markets. They like having a lot of state presence in the economy because it's useful politically. Also, in the standard story, holders of asset and mobile assets, and often, big businesses as well, they're the bad guys in the democracy story, right? They're afraid of democracy because the poor are going to tax them too much under democracy, so they support autocracy. So in our story, though, we argue that a different channel is that asset and mobile holders are also more vulnerable to pressure from the autocrat, right? So in this story, it might be that these guys are the victims rather than the bad guys. Finally, we talk about some ways to try to reduce workplace mobilization, and one of the best ways is by increasing media freedom. With that, I'll turn the floor over to my discussants, and I very much look forward to hearing what they have to say.
Thank you, Tim. We'll turn first to John.
Okay, so I first want to congratulate Tim and or John and David on a really terrific book. This is on a really important topic, the subversion of elections. It's innovative and it's focused on workplace politics, and it's comprehensive. Here's the questions it asks: what is it? Workforce politics. Does it work in getting people to vote? Why do the employers do it? What types of firms do they do it to? Who are the people who get mobilized? What do they think of it? And is it really undemocratic? And I was trying to think of questions they left on the table, and it wasn't totally clear to me that there were any. And Tim said it was methodologically rich, but you shouldn't listen to him because he wrote it. But I also think, having been a non-author, that it was really impressive, the range of evidence that they marshaled to make their case. Surveys of firms, surveys of workers, focus groups, in-depth interviews with voters. These original documents, like the one he showed, describing the strategies that are used, framing experiments, cross-national surveys to supplement this. Most of it's on Russia, but it's really impressive. And finally, there's clear stories here. What is it? Well, there's many forms, but the bottom line is that it's often coercive. Does it work? Yeah, really well. People go vote when they get coerced. Why do employers do it? Really, it's for the money. And that links to the question, what types of firms do it? The ones that are vulnerable financially if they don't. State-owned firms and firms that get contracts from the state, as well as others. Who gets mobilized? The people that work at these vulnerable firms. And when are they most vulnerable? When the labor market is tight because they don't have a lot of options. And what do the voters think of it? They really don't like it. And so there's crisp answers to important questions and a comprehensive set of questions. And then it ends with this idea of exploring how the book can help us understand whether it's anti-democratic or not to have this. And there's a very informative tour of some of the history in the US, culminating with the changes that happened in Citizens United. There's a clear statement of the conditions under which we have to worry about it being anti-democratic, whether it infringes on voter autonomy and whether it biases electoral outcomes. And there's an empirical claim that these are hard conditions to satisfy. So in fact, we should worry about it. So now, after lauding it, we'll go to the questions. The first thing I would be interested in Tim's reaction is, do we think that these potential problems of workforce politics are going to really be the same in autocracies and democracies? And the last chapter asks us to sort of think about the question in this way. But when it goes through the history of the US, for example, it finds a lot of problems, and the US responds to these problems. And it even seems like they're trying to respond to them now in the wake of Citizens United. A lot of evidence that other democratic countries are responding to the problems as they come up. And so they're sort of struggling with the democratic dimensions of workforce politics continually in the democracies. And there's evidence that Walmart is now, or not evidence, but you suggest that Walmart is now, doing some good voter mobilization. And if you look at your surveys in the US, people aren't really that worried about it. But most of the evidence from the book comes from Russia, and it is not at all a democracy. It is really bad. If you look at, for example, VDM scores, and it got worse between 2011 and 2017. And the other countries are Venezuela, Nigeria, Ukraine, and Turkey, and none of those are really democratic either. And so my question is, why should insights from that context help us think about whether it's democratic in the places like the US? And to illustrate, one way it kind of strikes me as odd, this is maybe not fair, but recall the conditions that you say are necessary for the workforce politics to be benign, when they don't infringe on voter autonomy and when there's no bias in the electoral outcomes. Well, I would say those are both satisfied in Russia, because it doesn't infringe on pro-voter autonomy because they have no meaningful autonomy. They're taking away nothing from nothing, right? Or something from nothing. And it can't bias the electoral outcomes because those are kind of predetermined. People know before they go. And so it's not clear totally that we would want to argue that this workforce politics is undermining democracy, because there isn't really one there. And so that makes me wonder, does it really apply those insights to places like here? I also think it'd be interesting to think about what the book teaches us about authoritarian politics, because that's how I read the Russian context. And how should we think about the effect of workplace politics first on the stability of authoritarian regimes? And there's a number of insights in the literature about how autocrats use institutions like elections and the legislatures that come with them to stabilize their power, and in particular stabilize it vis-a-vis competing autocratic elites. Um, and an important part of the answer is that those institutions like elections can provide information to the autocrat about how popular they are, how things are going, how popular the bureaucracy are, et cetera. And this workplace politics is really interesting because it totally undermines that channel. You can't learn if you're subverting the elections in this way. So I thought that was interesting. Another part of the literature on this, why do autocrats do these elections literature is about co-optation, that they can use elections to help figure out how to dole out credibly the payoffs to the competing elites. And maybe workforce politics is part of the story. Maybe it's really not as much about totally trying to influence the elections, but finding a way to say, hey, if you can demonstrate your support for us, you're going to get a bigger payoff. I mean, the fact that it goes primarily to state-owned firms or firms that are dependent on the state suggests that might be part of the story. And then another part of the literature on this, how do autocrats do it with these electoral institutions, is it helps them credibly commit to these payoffs. And to me, the workforce politics that you described seems like a nice commitment mechanism. You're basically in contracts with these companies, or you're determining how much support you get. So I thought it'd be interesting to think about how this institution of workforce politics sort of is related to autocratic politics. I also had the same question about democratization. That might those mechanisms I just described might help stabilize them in their fights with other contending elites who want to be the autocratic elites. But what about democracy? And the part of it that I think could be interesting that you didn't mention was, if you think about the people who are doing this, the state-owned firms and the firms that are linked through state contracts to the government, they might have a lot to lose from democracy. A lot of times when there's democratization, those state-owned firms are really undermined, as happened in some of these countries. And so maybe, even though they resent all this stuff that's going on, if it is necessary to avoid democracy, then maybe that's part of the story as well. And then the final question I would have is, I wonder what the effect of this is on the economic performance of these regimes, because the state-owned enterprises and the state-dependent, private enterprises are doing the autocrats' bidding in this context. And so maybe that's giving them some slack vis-a-vis their performance and as firms. They can say, hey, don't give me a hard time because my bottom line, because I was there helping you on election day. So if the government isn't playing by the rules in this context, maybe it fits part of the broader strategy of corruption that the government's using, and that has a negative effect on the enterprise. So I think it's really a terrific book. I think all the answers were clear. I thought the research was great, but it made me think about some different issues than the ones that were emphasized, in the book itself.
Great, thanks.
John. Alex.
Great. Well, thanks, Tim, so much for the opportunity to provide this rich discussion. I really enjoyed reading the book for a couple of reasons that I'll share. First, as you've heard from John, it's a really impressive accomplishment of comparative research. As a parochial Americanist, I find it challenging to collect data in just one country, and you've heard about the 9 different countries in which they've collected survey data, including, importantly, I'd call out both worker and firm level data. Interestingly, in the US, you might think it's an easier context to survey companies in than, say, Russia, but you actually don't see as much use of firm level survey data in the United States as you might expect. And I think that's a key model for the kind of work that people studying the political economy of the US should draw from. And like John mentioned, it weaves together multiple sources of data. You've got the survey data, the interviews, focus groups, and the archival material, found material from inside of these firms. And all of this is done, I should add, in really widely and accessible prose that is well organized and easy to follow. So I hope it finds a wide readership, not just in comparativists and Americanists, as I'll talk more about in a moment, but among the broader public who's interested in understanding how these issues unfold in different countries. Second, and more personally, The book has also, and the work going into it, has also inspired research that I've done. When I was in graduate school, the piece in World Politics that Tim, John, and David published on workplace mobilization in Russia inspired me to look into some of these questions in the United States, culminating in a book that I wrote called Politics at Work that looks at the practice of workplace mobilization just in the context of the United States, trying to understand how prevalent it is, the kind of workers who get engaged, and why firms are doing this. And I think Tim has alluded to some of these important contextual differences between the US and other countries. For instance, the lower prevalence of state-owned firms, freer and fairer elections, although TBD asterisks on that. Also TBD on the lack of as a higher proportion of state-owned enterprises as well. We'll see how that evolves. But more seriously, I think it's a great example of how more exchanges between US-focused scholars and comparative scholars can illuminate phenomena that we might not have otherwise focused on. We tend to think of the US as being in a different class than a lot of the countries that Tim studies, but we're actually seeing that some of these patterns are more common in the United States than we might think. And what I think Tim's book really adds to some of the US-specific work that I and others have done is pulling in the role of parties and politicians and thinking about the incentives that they have to pressure firms to do this kind of engagement, the dimension of state-owned enterprises in particular, as well as this dimension of press freedom and the risk of reputational backlash against companies that engage in this practice. And that really resonates with what I heard in the United States talking to managers as well. So I want to spend the rest of my time talking about two things. The first is what I think this book opens up for American-focused scholars, particularly when you think about politics in the workplace more generally. And then as a labor policy person, how should we think about policy responses in the United States? And this will actually touch on some of what John mentioned about how applicable the lessons from Tim's book are for the United States. So why should we learn from our comparativist friends about why the workplace is important? Well, I think what comes through so clearly in this book, and that political theorists like Robert Dahl have long called attention to, is the fact that the workplace is a really important site of identity formation, socialization, and connection with economic and political organizations. It can have real profound consequences for the economic resources we have, the time we have to engage in politics, the information we receive from coworkers, managers, and other organizations, and the opportunities for building organization through, for instance, labor unions or other worker groups. Despite the long recognition of this importance, the study of the workplace in the United States among Americanists has really withered, despite some of these foundational pieces from scholars like Robert Dahl. I think if there are folks in the room, graduate students who are thinking about potential topics, this is a really rich set of areas where I think there's a lot of opportunity for answering questions that we think pretty foundational, but surprisingly have few answers to. For instance, how do people's political views shape the type of workplaces they end up in? And how does that vary across different workers? How often do people have political conversations with their coworkers? And how often does that change their mind about political issues, in addition to the conversations they may be having for managers and employers? Does the increasing affective polarization that we're seeing in American politics affect the ability of people to have these kinds of conversations, and even the ability to do their work when their work touches on political issues, as in the case of K-12 instructors, as we were just talking about before the panel, or even in the case of doctors now, as more medical issues are becoming politicized? How do workplace issues like pay or schedules become political issues for workers? And how have foundational changes in the structure of the American workplace, for instance, the fissuring of the workplace, the greater use of independent contractors and gig employment, how has that changed the kind of political socialization that people have with coworkers and their managers, opportunities for labor mobilization and employment mobilization? These are pretty foundational questions that we surprisingly have few answers to at the moment. Nevertheless, I wanted to shout out a couple scholars who are doing really exciting work in this area that I think offer ways forward for us to think about both the data that would be necessary to answer these questions and the kind of answers that they're producing. So there's a fantastic postdoc here at Columbia at the Business School, Max Kagan, who's been working with a team of collaborators to merge together administrative data on voter records with LinkedIn data. So you can track voters' employment with specific firms and even the specific locations of those firms. And so he's and his co-authors are able to look at things around workplace mobilization in much more detail than I was able to do in my book. And for instance, he's studying how mobilization in ballot initiatives that pertain to particular companies. So think a utility that has a ballot measure that's about the regulation of that utility, in which there's mobilization by that employer of their workers. And he finds very large turnout effects on the employees of this kind of mobilization in down ballot, low salience races that aren't very politicized, but do pertain to a company's bottom line. In some cases, as large as 33 percentage point differences in turnout. So I think that's a great model of how new administrative data can unlock some more opportunities here. I'll also call out the work of Alan Yan, another fantastic graduate student at Berkeley, who's using administrative data on labor unions, members, and leaders to understand the kind of political conversations that are happening inside of unions, and especially what happens when there are political tensions between the rank and file of a union and the leadership. The rank and file members of unions, like Americans overall, have drifted to the right, but leaders still disproportionately are Democratic. So what kind of governance issues does that create within workplaces and within unions? So that's an example of some of the questions and some of the new research that I'm excited about around the workplace. Let me end by offering some reflections on what a policy response should be to the kind of mobilization that I documented in my book and that Tim documents in his. As Tim mentions, there is a very strong tradition dating back to the 1800s of giving employers rights, including for collective action and free speech in ways that really make it hard to control what employers can say in the workplace. This is perhaps clearest around labor issues. And so I don't think this is a productive path for reformers to focus on. I think the alternative approach that many reformers have focused on are creating dismissal or discipline protections for workers around political issues. So some localities, as Tim mentions, and I talk about in my book, have passed laws saying you can't be fired for your political views, even though we lack such a right at the national level. Here too, though, I'm quite pessimistic about the bite of these laws. We know across a variety of labor laws that it's really hard to enforce these kinds of protections. And that gets me at why I think the lessons from Tim's book are applicable in the United States, to answer your question, John. And that's because of this unusual structure of the workplace that we have in the US that we often don't talk about, that we take for granted. And it's called at-will employment. There is a fundamental assumption in the United States for workers who aren't in a union, who are in the private sector, and who don't have a contract or are tenured faculty, that your employer can fire you at any time and for any reason. And what that does is it shifts the burden on the worker to prove that dismissals or discipline violate some other protection. So of course we have laws preventing dismissals on the basis of, say, religion or sex or gender or national origin, but it turns out those laws are really hard to enforce because the burden of proof is on the worker, not on the employer. And it's quite easy in the context of the workplace to find a pretext for dismissals, particularly around an issue like politics. And for that reason, I just don't have a lot of faith in the ability of regulations around dismissals or discipline related to politics to protect workers. Instead, I think we should think about reforming our system of at-will employment. As I mentioned, the US is one of the few countries in the world, particularly among rich democracies, to have this approach. In most other countries, employers have to prove affirmatively why they're firing a worker, particularly for economic reasons or for egregious poor conduct. And I think that kind of move towards a just cause standard would both help democratize the workplace, making the relationship between workers and managers more egalitarian, and would also address the specific issue and concern of workplace mobilization. So I'll stop there and just reiterate my enthusiasm for this book, the way I think it really opens up some vistas for American-focused scholars to think more rigorously about the workplace and to engage more with our comparative colleagues.
Thank you.
Great. Jessica.
All right, thank you. So you should definitely buy this book. I was thinking how useful it is for thinking, sorry, I was thinking how useful it is for thinking about everyday life as I got off the train at 125th Street today, walked into my favorite coffee shop and noticed the sign that was behind the counter, NYC Africans for Zara.
Yeah.
Right? Common occurrence. But part of the question that Tim is trying to tackle with his co-authors of this book. So I'm going to offer a few comments that are in my head in dialogue with the book I wrote about a related phenomenon called Staging Democracy, which is mainly about Ukraine, but also about Russia and a little bit about the United States. So there's an implicit kind of dialogue here by way of thinking through what's left on the table. And I actually think there's quite a bit, which is not a criticism of the book, but rather an indication of how rich this topic is, and that there's a great deal that graduate students and others could pursue. The first thing I want to do, though, is offer my props to the incredible data collecting exercise that this book represents, because I do political ethnography, so different methodological orientation, but studying these same questions on the ground, I appreciate how incredibly difficult it is to design survey questions that actually get at the phenomenon under study. And this book is just incredible in my view. It's the best thing I've seen on Russia in that respect so far, in terms of quantifying some of these questions that are very sneaky because of employers wanting to hide the practice because of variation in what people think they're doing when they go to the ballot box, and a whole bunch of other things. So this is just as an empirical sort of foundation for studying these questions. This book is worth reading for that alone. So I'm going to offer a few comments about precarity, humiliation, and meaning, and then end with a note on engagement. So the book does address questions of precarity by way of thinking about, what are the situations in which people are more likely to be subject to pressure, especially in company towns or places where there's a large service sector, there are opportunities for employment. I want to also bring in here consideration of broader context of precarity in contemporary capitalist settings generally. And that is the relationship between experiences of loss, whether through enclosure, monetization of benefits, any number of inflation, any number of other different phenomena, and the credibility of employers' threats, right? So there's an extent to which in Russia, because of the experience of the early 90s of economic crisis, hyperinflation, people going to work without being paid, mass loss, job loss is thinkable in a way that it would not have been 15 years before. And I think that in thinking about the contemporary United States, for example, this becomes extremely relevant because if we look at the last month plus and the temporary cessation of SNAP benefits, right? This becomes part of a context in which people think of things that were not thinkable before, right, as possible punishments, and then enters into the ways in which they're, making decisions about how they behave at work. So I think the broader sort of context has to be incorporated in thinking about the political economy of workplace politics. There's more to do there and more to study, more to research in different national contexts. Secondly, unpopularity. This is an unpopular practice. Is that so bad, Tim, for the employers? And this is where humiliation is really important to sort of think about. Russian interlocutors talk about this all the time, right? The izdevательство, right? The action of making someone feel subject to your will, right, is itself socializing to authoritarianism. It's even arguably, right, moral injury is a tool of building a fascist state. Politicians with authoritarian ambitions regularly do things they know are unpopular because the act of doing them gives them power, right? In reading the book, I was thinking about a not entirely related, but nonetheless, example from this fall's political campaign for president, where they got a lot of press where Trump is giving a talk in an enclosed auditorium where the AC went off and it was super hot. People were standing for hours and he stops talking and he just has music playing. And he's standing there swaying. And television commentators basically thought this was bananas, right? And didn't make anything of this. But if you look at this from the perspective of a kind of savant politically, this was a very, smart move, right? Because two things happen. First of all, there's the idea that you're making people sit there in the heat, right, and listen to this music, and that itself is part of the building of hierarchy. And secondly, and this is related to the question of meaning, people come out of there with a shared experience. right? It might be a shared experience they don't appreciate, but it is nonetheless constitutive of group identity. And in that sense, you know, there are questions we still need to ask about how does the act of workplace mobilization actually change politics beyond specific electoral cycles, right? How does workplace mobilization itself transform hierarchies? How does it change relationships and the relationships in which it is embedded, right? When a professor gets graduate students, not just to, I don't know, move a table at a conference, but to go out and hold signs on, you know, in a public square, how does that change the nature of that workplace relationship outside of political mobilization? So there's a whole bunch of questions that still remain. And that too is related also to the question coming back to what do people think they're doing when they're voting? Greg Uden back in 2012 brought this up in a newspaper column in making the distinction between voting, between elections and voting, in which elections are choices, right? Where you go and you express a choice, and vote and balloting is where meaning of the act is to go and demonstrate your support for a particular candidate. And so through this process, right, of sorting, where some people are being mobilized and come to think about elections as a process of declaring loyalty, it changes the meaning of the signifier democracy, right, in people's minds, which then makes it harder to study with surveys, right? So there's a whole bunch of things to think about with respect to meaning. And then finally, in thinking about engagement, I was reading this book and thinking, all right, what if I were not someone who studied Russia? How would I interpret this comparison with Russia and the United States and democracies and non-democracies and some of the questions that John raised? One of the things that we don't see enough of in the book, in my opinion, that can be further researched, right, is the question of the vertical, the question of the politicization of bureaucracy, right? In the US, the examples that come up are kind of often, we think, one-off examples of some enthusiastic employer who's getting employees to support the candidate they want. But that's not really how it happens in Russia, right? And it's not how it happened in Ukraine during periods where there was a Russia-leaning president. And it's not how it happens, you know, in Venezuela, right? Or in any number of other contexts. In these contexts, workplace mobilization happens through, you know, someone in the presidential or executive office making a phone call to a governor, who makes a phone call to, you know, a district representative, who makes a phone call to all the local institutions, who make other phone calls to the companies in the area saying, you're not getting your tax write-off, you're going to see the fire inspectorate, you're going to see this, that, or the other thing if you don't deliver this number of votes, right? And so when we think about American politics, Schedule F, politicization of the bureaucracy, that's where the real interesting action is going to happen, right? We need to think about coordination and centralization. And that's something that doesn't come up in the question of, is this democratic or not democratic, depending on questions of voter autonomy. Like, we need to look beyond just the structural employment questions to the broader, questions of bureaucracy. And then finally, Tim, as I was reading this, I was thinking, there's so much literature that you were trying to pull in here.
Framing was a challenge.
But yeah. But I was also thinking I really wanted more conceptual engagement, right? With like Rosenfeld's work, or, you know, or even my own, or some others. And I think that is a question of barriers within our discipline, right? In which people who do use different kinds of methodologies just don't talk to each other very much, right? And that with more of that cross fertilization, we can push the theoretical value of our work much further. So anyway, you should all read this book and buy it. And I think it's great for thinking about everyday life, in addition to questions of political science.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you all.
This is great. I have actually, can I put this up again?
Yeah,
Only because I in my response, I can I'll start with the last comment first about let's see if I've got it here. Yeah. So so one of the things we try to do in this book is to argue that lots of people have looked at the relationship between employers and employees in the political mobilization. And in the US, that's the way it usually happens. You have some ideologically motivated business person of the left or the right, and they push in one direction. And it's not so much the case of the power vertical the way it is in Russia. So we have this for those non-Russian speakers. This is a telegram that was a telephonogram, actually. I'm not quite sure what the technology is, but this is from one of the largest steel companies in Russia. And this is the scheme that's used for who should report and how workplace mobilization should be organized. So this is the workers of the firm. If you're like the shop floor worker, you're here, then you report to your supervisor. Then you report to their senior supervisor, who then reports to the regional branch manager, who then reports to the head of the steel company, who then ostensibly reports to the state. And here's if you're a manager, you also have your own numbers to contact. So, and even with phone numbers, we kind of erase those in the book. But so this gives you some sense of how well this is organized. And we'd like to say a lot more about the relations between politicians and firms, but that's even harder to study. We do show that firms who engage in workplace mobilization are more likely to get state contracts in a kind of a diff and diff setting, which was a good result for us because it showed that this is something that managers didn't want to do themselves because they realized they often don't like to politicize the workplace. Takes people away from production when they're doing politics. So there are real kind of costs and benefits. But you're absolutely right. This is an area that's really right, particularly if we think about a multi-party setting. We also have Nigeria, Argentina, even our Turkey's surveys from 2015 when it's a very, very kind of competitive election. So there's a lot more. I agree with you. There's a lot more that we could do there. Yes, Alex is really great comments. Yes, this notion like the at-will employment, it's very similar in Russia, although often you do have to find a legal reason, but it's often not that hard. And two of the things that we talk about a little bit in the book, which might help point in very different political directions. One is liberalizing these labor markets. So like if one of the problems is that people are really afraid to lose their job, perhaps because they live in a company town, or their benefits are so tightly tied to their firm that if they lose their job, they're also going to lose their benefits. Liberalizing the labor market and making it easier for people to move between firms, is one way to reduce the power of employers and politicians. On the other hand, there does have to be, another way to solve this problem is from the left with a stronger, more well-organized labor movement to protect labor rights. Now, the political strategies for those two things are probably very difficult to coordinate, but those are, I think, two more promising ways to think about it than just kind of legal changes on the ground. And since Alex already answered John's questions about the relation between the U.S. case and the Russia case, but so this question of autocracy and democracy, we really struggled with this question because I think theoretically in our minds we were thinking of a kind of one-party setting where elections matter and where voters do have some autonomy. Because even in our Russia cases, we're looking from 2011 to 2018, and in 2011 the ruling party doesn't get 50% of the vote. I mean, so these are elections where voters do have some autonomy to express express their wishes. And so the argument is bounded by these situations where elections matter. In some sense, things have flipped after the war in Russia, where firms, I think, now are willing to advertise that they're engaging this behavior as to show their loyalty, whereas before they were much more worried about reputational backlash. And on, the economic performance, we thought a lot about kind of, like one could model this, I think, in a way that would be fruitful, to think about, the political benefits that one would get from workplace mobilization, from keeping the labor market rigid. But then the trade-off is, there's going to be slower economic growth. There's going to be less to distribute, and of course, autocrats need that as well. So actually, that's something I talked with Mike Ting a little bit about at some point as an avenue to explore. But given all we were doing in the book, that, along with many other interesting and fruitful passive research, fell by the wayside. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. All right, we will open it up to the audience. Questions? Yeah, questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a mindfulness in this way. So, positive evil guy stuff.
That's right. That's right.
And I think this is interesting because it's such a negative coercive form of clientelism. And so within sort of especially the Russian case, is there sort of a link in voters' minds at all between if you vote, even if you just turn out period, your firm will get some sort of utility in the future, or is it just solely coercive? So
it's interesting. In one of the focus groups that we conducted, some of the workers were saying, I don't blame the manager for doing this. He's on a year-to-year contract too. And if he doesn't, get us to turn out, then he's going to get in trouble. And there'll be somebody else who will do it just the same. So there was a sense in which this is broader than just like the personal relations between the particular manager and a particular worker, but they saw the role that this that this was playing in the broader political system. At the same time, it's important to remember that only a minority of firms engage in workplace mobilization, right? Most firms don't do this, either because they're too small and it doesn't really make sense. The employers don't really want to do this because it might divide the workplace, it might distract the workers. And we kind of floated this notion that there might be some kind of Kuznets curve of workplace mobilization where, in a primitive economy, you don't get it because there's not much hierarchy. And then with industrialization, you get the opportunities for engaging in workplace mobilization. But as the technology sectors and human capital becomes more prominent, it just becomes harder and harder to organize. So one of the interesting findings that we don't talk about in the book is that in almost every country, more educated workers are more likely to be mobilized. And one interpretation is that just a design effect of the surveys, that they're better able to understand and recognize the practice. That was one interpretation. But there's also, it might be that they are particularly likely to be mobilized, in part because in autocracies, better educated tend to be less supportive of the government. So they might be especially valuable workers to mobilize. So. Yeah.
So this sounds like a fascinating book, Tim. Thank you for writing it, and thank you to the panelists for a really thought-provoking discussion. I have so many questions, but I'm gonna be really brief. So the first one is about countries in which there's mandatory voting and whether that takes whether that deactivates this kind of logic. Another question is about strong versus weak unions, trade unions. I mean, I understand that in authoritarian contexts, like the unions might themselves be captured. So, but But maybe, a more consequential question for more democratic context. And another question about whether you said at some point that, they tell the employees, you have to turn out and vote because like they're tracking the turnout
Right.
data, but there was something about like, we don't care which way you vote.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, like, is it really the case that this doesn't compromise ballot privacy? Because I think like Isabella Maras argues that they find ways around that, right?
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
so the extent to which like this also violates the way in which,
Yeah,
which way, the privacy of the.
Yeah, so this is, a choice we made in the book was to focus more on turnout than on voting. In some settings, it's pretty clear. Telling people to vote is almost the same as telling to vote for the regime. And it is a little easier to collect those kinds of data. There's an interesting paper by Victoria Poltoratskaya, who, a former Harriman postdoc, by the way, let's fly the flag again, who finds that in large firms, the closer you are to a voting place, the higher turnout is, but the also higher vote for the opposition is. Now, there's a lot of problems with the argument, but it captures a little bit of like the logical extension of what our argument would be, is that if you're mobilized and you don't like it, and if you think your ballot is secret, then that's the pattern we expect to see. The problem is that there are lots of people in Russia who do think the ballot is secret, but a lot of people who think it's not. Another thing that employers will do is they'll ask voters to take a picture of their ballot with a check mark, like how they voted. And anecdotally, there are stories that people will put little pieces of black tape down, take the picture, and then remove the tape, and then vote. So like it's really like a cat and mouse game, but it's complicated. It's complicated to organize. And on unions, we don't talk enough about unions here. Other people have looked at it, and we had enough kind of on our plate already. And the two cases that we talked the most about are the US and Russia. But in Argentina, Turkey, in some sectors, they raise their own questions about voter autonomy as well. So there are interesting questions regarding democracy to be explored there.
Just quickly on the
Yeah.
union point, in
Yeah.
the US context, it's now been a while since I looked at the survey data, but my recollection was that there was no difference, or even unions were workers who were unionized reported slightly higher rates of employer mobilization in the US context. And a lot of that through interviews where it was joint lobbying. So, during battles over renewable energy that were being waged in Congress, when I was working on the book, both unions and employers were lobbying for subsidies. And you saw the same thing around trade issues as well. And so we might think about those issues as being normatively different when workers' interests are really closely tied up with a firm, for instance.
That's right. Protection.
Can I jump in with a two-finger on Kipu's last question about, I was also struck by it does not surprise me that people do not like being told whom to vote for, but that being told to vote is unpopular, even if it is like, we don't, you can vote for whoever you want. And so, you maybe partly answered that question already, that in some contexts, it's the same thing. People just implicitly it is but from the research, even when that's not the case, is it still unpopular to be told to vote? And if so, why?
People don't like politics in the workplace. I think there is the coercive element, and that's pretty clear. But even apart from that, people just don't, they recognize that this could be kind of conflictual, I think, and they just don't like it. So there's like a normative difference in workplace mobilization than, say, political party mobilization, which people say, oh yeah, that's fine, this is what they do. But why is I didn't sign up for this. when I went to work for this firm. So.
So I should take off my syllabus, the thing on voting day, election day, that says, vote if you're able, it's.
Well, I don't know, are you, it depends on whether, your students see that as implicitly coercive, or not. I take it you're not kind of tilting the playing field, which is our other dimension, but prior to Citizens United, there was much greater concern for this in the US. And one of the things that happened in Citizens United, you know better than I, is when they made the decision to end or to allow campaigning in the workplace, there were a whole host of protections that were put in place about how often you could ask workers to donate to political campaigns. And when the decision was overruled, all those protections were unraveled as well. And the court has not taken up those issues since then. So there's kind of a gray area where I cite in the book, like these legal scholars and compliance officers and firms are saying, look, it might be considered problematic, but these really highly motivated owners of firms are like, oh, I don't care, we're going to do it anyway. So.
Just good.
Yeah, no. Yeah.
Oh, very briefly, maybe just
Yeah.
jump in on a previous
Yeah.
point about the variation in workplace mobilization. And this is related to other directions for research for the future. Some of the changes we might see have to do with whether it's information economy or whether there are opportunities, but it's also important to remember that in authoritarian and hybrid regimes, this is all kind of calculated out in advance. And so it might not be happening in the workplace because pressure is being exerted elsewhere in the system, right? And that is really understudied as well, right? So in transportation, infrastructure, access, and your kids get a kindergarten place, housing, all these other places, sometimes the opportunities to push there are easier. Right, than in the workplace. So again, this is like one element of a whole toolkit that the rest of which also needs more study.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. Presentation is very fascinating.
I look forward to reading it. If I just slightly paraphrase your question, under which conditions do some firms resist those pressures from the politicians to engage in worker mobilization? And I wonder to what extent it's a matter of an individual choice, but particular firm managers, or whether it's a product of structural conditions, like the firm or economic conditions in this town.
Good. Yeah, we don't have a lot to say beyond, correlates of the type of firm and whether or not they engage in this practice and whether or not they receive kind of these state contracts in exchange. So we can document that kind of relationship. We don't have a lot to say about the firms that don't do this and why they don't do it. We do have a question in there where we say, why don't more firms do this? And they say, well, it's unacceptable. The workers don't like it. They don't say, the governor told me to do it, and I decided that I didn't want to do it because it would be bad for business. Which, I imagine that there are cases where people do this enthusiastically or willingly, and they advertise it, and others that do it on a much smaller scale. And so there has got to be some kind of gradation that we haven't been able to explore because a lot of this takes place behind closed door. We do have a couple of leaked transcripts of meetings between governors and the managers, but it's mostly the governor speaking and the managers listening. Like the governor saying, "You're all smart guys. You know what to do come election day." It's really kind of on that level. So,
Gemma?
yeah.
So let's one.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, okay, I'll be quick. Well, first of all, this resonates a lot also with the Italian examples I have in mind, so absolutely. But I was thinking about a fact that has been documented across countries, for example, in a paper in Brazil, which is that very often employers hire employees that are of their same political color.
Yeah.
And, you know, this might be genuine homophily, you know, you like
Yeah,
these
yeah, yeah.
people better, or it might also be actually that it makes it less costly to then tell them, go and vote. You know, you just have to tell them, hey, remember to vote rather than please vote for this candidate. And
That's right.
so I wonder if you think of this as also a place of workplace. Mobilization.
Yes, this is a question that's really worth studying, because one of the reasons why it's unpopular is because if you're in a workplace with people who hold diverse opinions, injecting politics is very unpopular and very divisive. If, however, you're in a firm where everyone is on the same political page, then maybe it's not so unpopular, at least for those workers. You know, maybe, you know, on average, if you'd ask people, you know, is this a good thing or a bad thing, they would be opposed. But to the extent that sorting happens, you know, it does have a big impact on the norm against engaging in workplace mobilization. So if that's the read, you know, on which employers are constrained from engaging in workplace mobilization, this kind of sorting could be really dangerous and you know, encourage an activity that we might think is problematic democratically.
Yeah, and that's been documented in the US too. There's a fantastic paper by Xiao Li, who's a junior faculty member at NYU, showing that when tech companies, I think it's all companies, but she had some vivid examples from tech companies in particular, when they encouraged their workers to donate to the corporate PAC, they alienated, you know, the off party essentially, and so they ended up raising less money than they might have otherwise by, you know, encouraging donations in one direction versus another.
Yeah, but it is this, you know, there are anecdotes or speculation out there that this kind of sorting is happening more in the US.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to see, you know, the extent to which that's really true. So
David Stark's work from years ago.
Oh,
right,
God, yeah,
in
yeah.
Eastern Europe, which showed
Yeah.
patterns of donations in both directions, right, in competitive contexts, which is a whole different kind of sort of navigation of workplace
that's right.
pressures.
That's right.
Well, thank you to the audience for great questions, to the panelists for great comments, to Catherine for organizing, for Tim and
It's-
co-authors for writing this terrific book. For those of you who haven't read it, you can tell from the conversation the richness that's in it. And thank you. And now we get to go enjoy food.
Thanks. Hey.
Vegetarian Indian food in the other
Oh,
room.
excellent.
You can enjoy me, cost $5.
Yes, yes.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Right, Kara would want me to say, but thank you.